as far as like trying to get together and make us interact,
Yes.
it's because I really wouldn't like that. I don't like them in that setting.
The story of the Brown family has always been framed as a grand social experiment, a demonstration of how plural marriage could work in modern times. But behind the glossy claims of faith and unity, the reality was dysfunction, resentment, and manipulation. The cracks didn't show up all at once. They began in the smallest of places: hallways, ponds, kitchens, staircases, and grew into gaping chasms that swallowed the family whole. What looked like trivial disputes on the surface were actually symptoms of something much deeper: control, hypocrisy, gaslighting, and the refusal to accept responsibility. If you track the timeline carefully, each conflict reveals not just human flaws, but a system built on inequity and denial. Take the so-called hallway controversy. At first glance, it sounds petty. Meri didn't want kids running through her house as a shortcut between apartments. But when you peel back the layers, the picture becomes clearer. 13 children stampeding through her living space like it was a Chuck E. Cheese arcade, muddy footprints, slammed doors, and constant chaos. Meri dared to ask for boundaries in a world where boundaries were treated as betrayal. She said she didn't want to be the hallway to other people's children, that her home was not a thoroughfare, and for that, she was branded controlling, selfish, even cruel. But why? Because in this family, peace and privacy were luxuries, and anyone who demanded them threatened the fantasy. Meri's need for basic respect became twisted into a moral failing, while the real failure, the lack of rules, the lack of planning, the refusal of leadership, was ignored. The architecture wasn't her idea. The endless foot traffic wasn't her doing. But still, she became the villain. Her so-called crime was wanting a door that meant something. Then came the pond drama, the infamous land battle that exposed just how shallow the claims of unity really were. Property division should have been about fairness, respect, and long-term planning. Instead, it became a war zone over who got the most scenic view. Access to a murky, disease-prone pond became the stand-in for status, power, and favoritism. Christine wanted her share, Janelle wanted practicality, and of course, Cody and Robyn carved out their prime spots with little regard for balance. The symbolism was undeniable. This wasn't about family, it was about territory. They preached about one big family, but when it came to carving up the land, it was every wife for herself. The hypocrisy was staggering. The sisterhood dissolved into property claims, each plot of dirt exposing the truth that polygamy was never about shared sacrifice. It was about competition, about securing an advantage, about pretending to cooperate while quietly plotting for oneself. The pond wasn't just a pond, it was the mirror that reflected the rot. The leadership vacuum only made matters worse. Cody was supposed to be the head of the household, the one who created order, set rules, and managed logistics. But his version of leadership was all talk, no plan. He sold spiritual fantasies while ignoring the daily realities of running a massive family. No clear household rules, no strategy for chores, no accountability for the chaos. He gave long lectures about loyalty, but disappeared when actual management was required. Who stepped in instead? The children. Logan, barely more than a kid himself, waking up at 5 a.m. to cook breakfast for younger siblings like a live-in butler. Christine homeschooling while exhausted, Janelle working full-time to keep money coming in, Meri left to fend for herself, and Cody, either off to some vague business meeting, or, as some suspected, chasing another half-baked scheme like his so-called gun show plans. The cracks in his so-called authority became craters. He wanted the perks of leadership, obedience, status, devotion, but none of the responsibilities. He was not a leader, he was a saboteur of his own household. Christine's evolution adds another layer of complexity. For years, she presented herself as the cheerful homemaker, the eternal optimist holding the family together with smiles and casseroles. But beneath that surface was jealousy, frustration, and resentment that never truly went away. She admitted to being jealous, but always with a but. Yes, I was jealous, but it was someone else's fault. She shifted blame with the same ease Cody shifted wives. It's a pattern of deflection that made accountability a foreign concept. When she told the infamous ring story, laughing as she shaded Cody, it wasn't just a joke. It was a performance, a way to reframe her pain as empowerment without ever owning her role in the dysfunction. And yet, who could blame her? After giving birth to 6 children, after multiple miscarriages, after being pushed aside for someone younger and shinier, the anger was justified. She was mocked, dismissed, gaslit, told she wasn't enough. She made concessions again and again for the sake of her kids, while receiving nothing but scraps of attention in return. Her jealousy wasn't baseless. It was survival in a system designed to make women compete for crumbs of affection. The tragedy is that none of the adults are innocent. This was one giant group project where everyone failed in different ways. Meri's boundaries were vilified instead of respected. The pond property revealed selfishness masquerading as family unity. Cody's refusal to lead created chaos and resentment. Christine's deflections allowed her to escape accountability while still casting herself as a victim. Every moment, every dispute, every tear-filled confessional pointed to the same truth. This was never about love or faith. It was about control, image, and survival. And the timeline tells the story better than any confession ever could. First, the hallway controversy, exposing how even the smallest request for boundaries could be twisted into betrayal. Then, the pond drama, a fight that revealed how property mattered more than people. Next, the collapse of leadership, with Cody's hollow words leaving children to pick up adult responsibilities. And finally, Christine's exit, wrapped in empowerment, but still stained with the scars of jealousy and denial. Each step, each argument, each fracture moved the family closer to collapse. The powerful words that hang over this entire saga are not faith, family, or sisterhood. They are manipulation, hypocrisy, control, and betrayal. Gaslighting turned reality upside down. Boundaries became sins. Competition was disguised as sisterhood. And every time accountability came knocking, someone else was blamed. The truth is brutal. The Browns didn't fail at polygamy because the world didn't understand them. They failed because their system was built on lies. Lies about unity, lies about equality, lies about sacrifice. The hallway was never just a hallway. The pond was never just a pond. These were battlefields in a war that was already lost. And by the time the dust settled, the only thing left was bitterness, broken trust, and the wreckage of a family that was doomed from the start. This is not just a reality show imploding on itself. It is a case study in how denial and control corrode everything they touch. And if you watch closely, you'll see the pattern in every scene. Boundaries rejected, responsibilities dodged, jealousy denied, leadership absent. The cycle repeats until there is nothing left to salvage. And the saddest part, the next generation has already learned the lesson. They want nothing to do with this lifestyle. They saw the chaos up close, they lived through the manipulation, and they walked away. That is the final verdict, the proof written not in confessionals or property deeds, but in the choices of the children who refused to repeat their parents' mistakes. The Browns wanted to prove polygamy could work. Instead, they proved the opposite. And no matter how many tears are shed or stories are rewritten, that truth cannot be buried. It lingers in every hallway, every pond, every broken promise, and every child who refuses to carry the torch forward. The story of sister wives has always been dressed up as one of sacrifice, faith, and unity. But when you strip away the glossy language and the emotional confessionals, what emerges is something far darker, a pattern of manipulation, gaslighting, and carefully orchestrated control. The most striking examples of this manipulation revolve around three central themes: Meri's divorce, Robyn's children's adoption, and the endless hypocrisy of Robyn's self-styled Earth Mother image. Together, they expose the truth that this family wasn't held together by love or principle, but by a cycle of exploitation and performance. And when you walk through the timeline of these events, the pattern becomes undeniable. Decisions were never made for fairness or equality. They were made for convenience, for optics, and for protecting Robyn's carefully curated version of reality. Let's start with Meri's divorce, one of the most shocking twists in the series, not because it happened, but because of the way it happened. Viewers were told that Meri's legal divorce from Cody was necessary so that Robyn's children from her previous marriage could be adopted. It was framed as a noble sacrifice, a heartbreaking act of love for the greater good of the family. But dig just one layer deeper, and the cracks in the story are glaring. Legal experts pointed out that there was another route. Cody could have adopted the children as long as their biological father relinquished his rights and the children gave consent in court. A simple, clean process that didn't require Meri to give up her legal marriage. But that wasn't the path chosen. Why? Because it wasn't about necessity. It was about control. It was about optics. It was about paving the way for Robyn to secure her place not just spiritually, but legally, as the one wife who mattered. The narrative presented on screen made it sound like Meri volunteered, but if you watch closely, the signs of emotional bargaining are all over the place. Cody dangled promises, floated the divorce as a step toward healing, and left Meri clinging to hope that her sacrifice would bring her closer to him again. Except it didn't. The only one who benefited long-term was Robyn. She got the legal security, the recognition, the piece of paper that ensured her position, while Meri was left humiliated, stripped of status, and told to smile through the pain for the cameras. That wasn't sacrifice. That was sabotage, disguised as duty. It was emotional manipulation broadcast as love, and the betrayal cut deeper than any outsider could fully grasp. Meri wasn't just losing her legal tie to Cody, she was losing the illusion that she mattered at all. Fast forward to the COVID years, and the manipulation takes on a new, more insidious form. Families everywhere struggled with pandemic rules, but in the Brown household, those rules became another weapon. Robyn staged what can only be described as a guilt-laced performance for her children, carefully laying out that Christine and Janelle's families wouldn't be joining Thanksgiving. She didn't present it as a simple fact, a health precaution, or even an adult disagreement. She presented it as betrayal. She wrapped her words in concern but laced them with poison. They're not coming because they're not following the rules. Maybe they can't. Maybe they won't. She wasn't sure. But the implication was crystal clear. Your siblings, your extended family, they've abandoned you. She even added dramatic flourishes, mentioning Gabe's girlfriend, as though a teenager's social life was proof of moral failure. The result was predictable. Her children absorbed the message that they were victims, left out, discarded, unwanted. Instead of shielding them from adult conflict, Robyn invited them into a narrative designed to wound. It was not parenting, it was performance. A calculated delivery of emotional pain disguised as concern. And once again, it was Robyn who benefited. She positioned herself as the suffering mother, the one who tried so hard, while everyone else failed. Her children grew up with a worldview of rejection and isolation, and the fracture in the family only deepened. It's important to understand that this wasn't just about Thanksgiving dinner. It was about control through guilt, about shaping her kids' loyalty by making them believe everyone else was the enemy. That's not love, that's indoctrination. And then there is Robyn's carefully crafted Earth Mother image, a role she has played with relentless dedication. She presents herself as natural, self-sacrificing, the devoted mother who does everything the right way. Home births, handmade dresses, emotional confessions. On the surface, it all looks like virtue, but scratch the surface, and the hypocrisy is everywhere. She boasts about home birthing, subtly criticizing Christine for using hospitals and epidurals, as though her choices made her more authentic, more dedicated, more motherly. She frames herself as the superior caregiver, yet quietly employs a nanny, even while being a stay-at-home mom with a stay-at-home dad beside her. The math doesn't add up. The image doesn't match the reality. This pattern of contradiction stretches into everything she touches. The nanny represents convenience, but she frames it as necessity. The home births represent sacrifice, but they also reflect doctrinal anxiety rooted in fear-based teachings, not empowerment. And then there's Sister Wives' Closet, the ill-fated jewelry business. Robyn positioned it as her great contribution, her dream, the way she would support the family. But the designs were bizarre, the pricing absurd, and the execution amateurish. It failed not because the family didn't invest enough, but because the product had no value. Yet when Meri dared to consider her own ventures, like going back to school or running a legitimate bed and breakfast, suddenly personal ambition became a threat. Robyn's failing dream had to be protected at all costs, even if it meant crushing everyone else's. The hypocrisy wasn't just annoying, it was systemic. Her identity was built on appearing selfless, while quietly demanding that every resource orbit around her. If you line up these events, the divorce, the guilt trip, the Earth Mother hypocrisy, the pattern is unmistakable. Every time there was a choice to be made, it was made for Robyn's benefit. Every sacrifice came at someone else's expense. Every narrative was bent to position her as the martyr, the victim, the center of gravity. And every time someone tried to break free, they were shamed, silenced, or painted as disloyal. That is not unity. That is control. That is not sacrifice. That is sabotage. And that is not motherhood. That is performance, weaponized for status and security. The timeline makes it clear. First, Meri's divorce reframed as noble sacrifice, but really a power grab. Then, the COVID Thanksgiving staged as tragedy, but really an exercise in emotional warfare. And finally, the endless Earth Mother posturing, a carefully constructed facade that crumbles the second you look too closely. These were not isolated incidents. They were chapters in the same story, a story of manipulation, hypocrisy, and betrayal dressed up as love, faith, and sacrifice. And the cost? It's written all over the family's collapse. Meri, stripped of dignity. Christine, suffocated until she walked away. Janelle, disillusioned and done. Children growing up under the shadow of guilt and alienation. And viewers, left to watch as the illusion of polygamy crumbled under the weight of its own lies. The Browns claimed to prove that plural marriage could work. What they proved instead is that it cannot survive when built on manipulation and control. And in this story, the truth always comes out, no matter how many tears are shed to cover it. Sister wives have always been wrapped in the language of family, faith, and unity, but underneath the glossy production is a raw truth about control, manipulation, and illusion. Few storylines capture that more vividly than the saga of Sister Wives' Closet, Robyn's doomed jewelry business, her ambiguous claims of working, and the strange subplot of doll therapy purchases that seem to symbolize the emotional chaos inside the family. When these threads are stitched together, what emerges is not simply the story of a failed business or eccentric hobbies, but a full portrait of how this family ran on hypocrisy, coercion, and self-deception. What looked like unity was really control. What was sold as sacrifice was really exploitation. And what was framed as faith was, in fact, performance. Sister Wives' Closet was introduced as Robyn's dream, a noble idea to give the wives a shared business venture that would empower the family financially. On paper, it sounded like a bold step forward. In reality, it was a disaster from the very beginning. The designs were bizarre. Clumsy silver hearts gripped by elongated skeletal hands, charms that looked less like symbols of love and more like props from a horror movie. The branding was inconsistent, the website amateurish, the prices wildly out of sync with the product, over $150 for pieces that looked mass-produced, uninspired, and frankly, unattractive. From the very first launch, sales numbers told the story. 8 pieces sold at a convention staffed by 5 adults, trickling into a mere 175 units over the course of 18 months. Any business analyst could have declared it unviable, but instead of admitting the truth, Robyn doubled down. She didn't treat the failure as evidence of poor design or weak market fit. She reframed it as the family's fault. Not enough investment, not enough help, not enough loyalty. And so, the cycle of control continued. Christine, Janelle, and even Meri were pressured to pour time and energy into a venture that was clearly sinking, even as their own ambitions were ridiculed or blocked. Meri's interest in going back to school, treated as betrayal because it meant less time for Robyn's jewelry. Janelle's financial pragmatism, cast aside in favor of chasing Robyn's fantasy. Even the possibility of investing in Meri's bed and breakfast, a viable income-generating business, was treated with skepticism and resistance. The message was clear: the only dreams allowed were Robyn's. Everyone else's ambitions were either dangerous or selfish. This wasn't business. It was emotional blackmail disguised as entrepreneurship. It was exploitation in plain sight. But the business fiasco was only one side of the story. Robyn's ambiguous relationship with work became a running theme that exposed even more layers of hypocrisy. Over and over again, she claimed she was busy, that she was working, that she was sacrificing her time for the sake of the family. Yet every time anyone asked what she was actually doing, the answers were vague, evasive, or completely unbelievable. Was she really managing an online store? Was she ghostwriting Etsy reviews to help other sellers? Or was she, as some suspected, simply inventing the idea of work as a shield against criticism while indulging in personal distractions? The more she claimed to be overworked, the less evidence there was of actual results. For a woman with a stay-at-home husband and a nanny, the narrative of endless burden simply didn't match reality. Then came the most bizarre subplot of all: the dolls. Thousands of dollars spent on delicate figurines, bizarrely presented as therapy, as emotional support, as a form of coping with stress. At first glance, it seemed eccentric but harmless, but over time, it came to symbolize the dysfunction of the family itself. Robyn poured money into dolls, while real family crises went unresolved. She created emotional performances around these objects while ignoring the deeper fractures tearing the Browns apart. It was consumption dressed as healing, theater disguised as therapy, and once again, the family was expected to treat it as legitimate, to play along with the illusion rather than confront the obvious truth. The dolls weren't healing anything. They were a distraction from reality, another layer of denial piled onto a family already drowning in it. If you map the timeline, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. First, Sister Wives' Closet launches with pomp and self-importance, quickly reveals itself as commercially unviable, and instead of accepting responsibility, Robyn demands more sacrifices from everyone else. Next, her claims of work become a running excuse for why she can't do more at home, why her children need nannies, why she deserves endless sympathy, even though the evidence of real labor is absent. And finally, the bizarre investment in dolls creates a metaphor for the entire family: fragile, artificial, expensive, and ultimately meaningless. Each stage is a step deeper into the vortex of gaslighting and hypocrisy. The broader theme is even more damning. This family ran on control, not cooperation; on coercion, not choice. Boundaries were ignored, ambitions were crushed, and reality was rewritten in service of appearances. Gaslighting became a daily ritual. Wives told they were selfish for wanting independence, children told they were disloyal for questioning authority, everyone told they were a family, while evidence of fracture stared them in the face. Unity was a slogan, not a practice. Faith was a cover story, not a foundation, and sacrifice was demanded, not shared. What makes this saga even more haunting is the way it ends, not with redemption, not with reconciliation, but with rejection. The next generation has already spoken with their choices. They want nothing to do with this lifestyle. They watched the manipulation, they lived the chaos, they absorbed the guilt, and they walked away. That is the final verdict, the most damning proof of all. It's not just that Sister Wives' closet failed, or that doll therapy became a spectacle. It's that the system failed so completely that even those raised inside it refused to carry it forward. The illusion died with them. When you look back at the rise and fall of this family, the jewelry business, the vague jobs, and the dolls might seem like side plots, but they are actually the keys to understanding everything. They show how delusion was prioritized over truth, how appearances mattered more than accountability, and how control was always the real goal. They show how the women were manipulated into silence, how ambitions were crushed, how energy was siphoned into protecting one person's narrative instead of building real stability. And they show why, in the end, the family imploded. It wasn't COVID, it wasn't jealousy, it wasn't cultural misunderstanding, it was control, gaslighting, and hypocrisy. Those were the true cornerstones of Sister Wives, and once exposed, no amount of tears or theatrics could cover them again. Thanks for watching.